Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you all to the high-level plenary session, Resetting the EU-US Synergy Towards the Western Balkans. I'm Alexandra Voudouri, journalist, and I will be the moderator of the two panel discussions aiming to explore how the two global powers, namely the European Union and the United States of America, could jointly make once again a big difference in the Western Balkans. Following the change of guards at the White House after 4 years of turbulent relations, it is undoubtedly high time for the EU to tackle unfinished business in the Balkans, while there is a foreign policy team in Washington, D.C., who can bring intricate knowledge to Balkan issues. The recent EU-US summit has sealed the renewal of the strategic partnership of the two superpowers, but the question is whether there is indeed a clear joint strategy of both sides for this part of Europe, which unfortunately largely remains outside the European Union. The other question is whether this strategy could meet the expectations of the countries of the Western Balkans region. So today's two panel discussions serve this purpose, that is to find out the answers to the above questions. And with these words, I would like to give the floor to President of the Republic of North Macedonia, Mr. Stevo Pendarovski. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
It's okay? Yeah. Good morning to everybody. I can say at the very beginning that you have picked up a very interesting topic. And for those who had forgotten, I would like to reiterate once more, resetting synergy of European Union and the United States in regarding to the Western Balkans. So the very first question I would like to pose to everybody is, what kind of reset do we like to see between these two states and entities regarding our region? And is it possible at all to see the reset we have seen in the early 1990s and throughout that decade? In my judgment, no. And that's a negative news for the region. What has changed in the meantime? In the meantime, has the world changed dramatically? It seems to me more or less that the Western Balkan region is the same, but the war. Political will for having established against synergy is not in question, of course, but we are speaking about the national interests of the actors involved. Political will on the part of Brussels, and national interests of the member countries of the European Union, national interests of the United States of America, and of course national interests of the countries in the region, Western Balkans 6. It is true that after 9/11, the United States has shifted their interests elsewhere, mostly towards the Pacific. It is true, in my view at least, that the European Union has become less coherent in the meantime, mainly because of the failure to adopt European Constitution and unsuccessful referenda in 2004 and 2005 in France and Netherlands. And the political will on the rhetorical level among the regional political leads is the same. About the substance behind that rhetoric, we can discuss at length. In my view, at this point, a reset is possible only in the form of the reset light. Then I can bet on that option, that we are not going to see synergy between two parts of that transatlantic community, which are so dear and important to us, alike in the 1990s. It means that the bigger part of the responsibility will stay on the shoulders of the regional political leads. It is known that the so-called triangle of success for any breakthrough in a positive direction in the Western Balkans has been Brussels, Washington, D.C., and regional capitals. What is the state of affairs regarding this last element at present? EU is certainly not capable of leading alone. United States of America wouldn't like to lead alone. And the regional elites are not interested. I would like to be fully honest with everybody, because I'm part of that regional elites, generally speaking, are not interested to push for the real and thorough transformation of our societies. The end result is Western Balkan, in the past decade at least, is lagging in the economic terms well behind the European Union, even more than comparing the periods before that, let's say in the early 2000s. Washington, D.C. is here but only to register or to witness the decline of all democratic indicators, for example, Freedom House indicators. So in democratic terms speaking, Western Balkan is behind back what used to be 10, 15 years ago, and Western Balkan has 18 million inhabitants only on paper. In reality, we have 4 million less. I wouldn't like to end with the negative note. I suppose that might be, for some of you, the somber note of my address to you. But if we are not really trying to re-establish some connections, which has been so fruitful in the 1990s, in the different circumstances, under a different environment, then no one can say 10 years from now that the Western Balkan has succeeded. I'm not speaking about the formal integration only in the European Union. I'm speaking about the real reforms on the spot, on the terrain, and I'm speaking about the happiness of our people who would like finally, after so many years being in the long transitional tunnel, would like to see prosperity of their societies. And of course, somehow, in the next 3, 5, 7, 8 years, to slow down the very negative processes of emptying out the region, because the brightest, the youngest, the most dynamic force are leaving the region, and in essence, we are not going to have anybody to rely upon if we like to see reinvigoration of our economies. So help us to help the people living in this region. Saying this, I wouldn't like to excuse myself and everybody else being in charge, in power in the 6 regional countries, but without the combination of our energies and our vision and our projects, we cannot succeed. It's okay to have these kind of conferences. It's a good one to see the familiar faces. I saw a few of them, which has been quite active in a very difficult 2001 for North Macedonia. And I cannot say to them, seeing some of them after 2 decades, that too much has fundamentally changed in my country. So it's time for a restart. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Very clear messages there. and very specific concerns about the young generation of this region. Now, we will continue our discussion with President of Montenegro, Mr. Milo Djukanovic, President of a country which is a rather front-runner in the EU accession process, for his introductory remarks. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this exceptional opportunity to speak in this forum, and I would like to congratulate you for the idea of inauguration of PRESPA Forum 3 years after the PRESPA agreement was signed. And I believe PRESPA agreement was one of very important political events in the Balkans in our recent history. Good understanding and high responsibility of our friends here in Skopje and equally in Athens led to a very important agreement that I believe announced a clearer and more foreseeable European perspective, not only for this country, but for the entire region. I would like to congratulate the beginning of work of this forum, and I believe that it will become one of the prestigious places and fora where we will discuss responses to regional and global challenges. And I want to congratulate you for choosing this topic. Allow me to start with a little reminiscence. I think it might be useful, and I think you will understand why I'm starting like this. So in the 90s, just after post-communist countries started adopting values of liberal democracy of the Western type, so a couple of years after that start, former Yugoslavia fell apart in blood. I am not just trying to remember bad things to help me, but I think that it is important to remember that here, in this place and this time. And I will explain why. Lately, in the last couple of years, we are used to receiving good and very threatening news from Western Balkans. The good news were that Montenegro managed in 2016 to become a member of NATO in spite of a very strong opposition of Russia. After that, thanks to the solution of the long dispute between Greece and Northern Macedonia, North Macedonia also became a member of NATO. 2 years ago, the first action plan for membership in NATO was adopted for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and leaders of the Western Balkans in the Berlin process signed an agreement on the establishment of the common market. So these were the good news. But there was some bad news as well. And those are that whether we like it or not, and whether we want to admit it or not, we do have a standstill in the enlargement policies of the European Union to the Western Balkans. For a long time, they talked about the fatigue, and after that, they stopped saying that. But the poor dynamics and lack of energy remained. So today, we logically speak about the decline of Euro enthusiasm in the Western Balkans, and it seems to me that frequently in the discussions that we have when we meet as leaders of the countries of the Western Balkans, the officials from Brussels keep saying to us that we don't have sufficient rule of law in the Western Balkans and that the reforms lost their energy and pace. And we keep warning that bad messages from certain European centers actually caused the decline of Euro enthusiasm. You know, you remember that the last or previous European Commission had one of the first messages that there would be no enlargement during their term of office. And also there were some other messages from other centers that were not in line with the announcement of the new Commission and Ms. von der Leyen. I think all of that together was very bad for what we have today in the region of the Western Balkans. So that policy, unfortunately, led to the penetration of interests of third parties in the Western Balkans. You know, we can be angry in Europe and in Western Balkans about that, but I think that it is expected, and I can say that it is almost legitimate Because, you know, some space has opened, and other countries that have a system of values that is opposite to the system of values of European Union are trying to exercise their geopolitical interests. I mean, if we want to avoid that, we have to have more of Europe in the Western Balkans. Europe was not sufficiently present, and now we can see aggressive geopolitics in Western Balkans that is opposite to the European system of values and European unity. So Western Balkans has become one, but very important battlefield where East is fighting West and Western system of values. As a consequence, we in the Western Balkans have been dealing with the same dilemmas as in the 90s. And one of those dilemmas was whether multi-ethnic harmony in our region is possible. You know, you can ask that rhetorically, but I think it is a senseless question. I mean, why would Western Balkans seek for a formula that is different from the formulas used in the entire world? In the 90s, we had to pay for this dilemma in human lives, 150,000 human lives. At that time, the intention was to establish greater Serbia, greater Croatia, and as a consequence also greater Albania. And instead of those greater countries, we got a greater tragedy. And now, 20-some years later, after the Dayton Agreement, we have this idea on the table again. And why? Because the perspective for Western Balkan countries to become members of European Union has been blurred. I think that geopolitical significance of European perspective of the Western Balkans is being neglected. We keep forgetting how many good things the enlargement policy brought to Central and Eastern Europe. And we forget that many political crises that Europe went through had a beginning in the Western Balkans, actually. So I think that it is very important that we go back to a more realistic view of the geopolitical significance of European perspective of the Western Balkans. And what is encouraging, as Stevo mentioned, is the restoration of Euro-Atlantic cooperation. So it seems to me that in the last 4 years, we had tragic mistakes on both sides of the Atlantic. They neglected Euro-Atlantic heritage. I am a great advocate of Euro-Atlantism. I think that after the Second World War, it brought many advantages, not only to Europe and America, but for the entire world. So I did not manage to understand why we have become so skeptical towards that most valuable heritage of Europe and America. But what is the most important, I am encouraged by the messages that we could hear from Washington after presidential elections. I am very encouraged by positive reflections from European capitals. So I believe that this restored Euro-Atlantism will open new perspective of logically accelerated European integration of our region. And in the end, I would like to say that there is no dilemma. We don't want to turn our responsibility to somebody else's back. No, the most important job has to be done at home. We have to do it at home, and we do not even think of getting any kind of shortcut for integration. We could see what shortcuts in that process might result in. We don't want that. We want to be full-fledged members of the European Union. We want to meet all the criteria, but we all have to understand, all of us and our Euro-Atlantic partners, there is no irreversibility in the process of democratic transition. European values have not been inherent in the Western Balkans. It is actually the opposite. Western Balkans has been lagging behind because it was declining to join the rest of Europe for a long time. So we were out of the mainstream for a long time, and now we have to push the process of European integration. And all together, we have to seek to find more space for the liberal democracy of Western type in Western Balkans. I believe in that. I believe that is a good perspective. I am encouraged with the things that I mentioned, and I hope that we will avoid repeating the bad scenario for Western Balkans that we lived in such a recent past. Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you. And let's keep that you are quite encouraged by the new Euro-Atlantic heritage that will bring new perspective in the region. Now, Slovenia, since yesterday, is holding the presidency of the European Union Council for the second time, assuming this role after 13 years. So we are very pleased to have here with us the President, Borut Pahor. Mr. President, you know better than me that the expectations are quite high for the Slovenian EU presidency, and whether the next 6 months could represent an excellent opportunity to push forward the enlargement agenda. The floor is yours, Mr. President. Thank you.
That's mine.
Good morning, everyone. The enlargement of the European Union to the countries of Western Balkans is a geopolitical question of the first order. Western Balkan countries themselves need to speed up the adoption of reforms and implementations of measures to this end, but the faster enlargement is above all in vital interest of the European Union. What is needed is a more geostrategic approach to the enlargement and to see the region of Western Balkans as a whole. It would be the best if the European Union decides to, and reasonably soon, include in the EU all Western Balkan countries and to adopt its enlargement strategy accordingly. The absorption capacity of the EU is sufficient enough for a fast enlargement with Western Balkans. The enlargement of the EU to the countries of the Western Balkans is also increasingly becoming a matter of time. The slow pace of the enlargement is weakening the trust in the European future in these countries. That results in the rise of nationalism. It also leaves the space open for the influence of third countries. A faster EU enlargement to the Western Balkans would reduce the importance of naive and dangerous ideas of border change, which in my opinion cannot happen in a peaceful way due to the complexity of the situation. That is why I reject all those ideas of changing the borders. A faster process of inclusion of Western Balkan countries in the EU would significantly strengthen the principle of territorial integrity of these countries and also the stability and the security of the region and the Europe as a whole. With enlarging to the Western Balkans, the EU remains an unfinished peace project because it directly touches the European promise of prosperity, well-being and stability. In mid-May, I hosted the leaders' meeting of the Brdo-Brioni process. After a rather heated and difficult discussion, we agreed on all main principles. We need the US as a partner. We need to work hand in hand with our transatlantic partners. It is interesting that NATO has more capacity and willingness to understand geopolitics in Western Balkans. The NATO enlargement to the Montenegro, Albania, and North Macedonia is of tremendous importance. So, let me conclude by reiterating how important the fast enlargement of the EU to the Western Balkans is. Enlarging EU with the entire Western Balkans region is a paramount political precondition for the stable, prosperous, and sustainable future of Europe. Delaying the start of negotiation with North Macedonia is unreasonable. Even more, it's not just politically wrong, it's morally wrong. It also undermines the authority of EU. So, I cannot, as the President, speak on behalf of the government, but I would say that Slovenian government will do its best to unblock the process during our EU presidency. And I wish all the best to North Macedonia, Albania, and everybody, because I think this is our common destiny. So, Mr. President, Stevo, next week I'll travel to Bulgaria. Myself, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, everybody will try to do during our presidency our utmost to maybe unblock this issue and let both North Macedonia and Albania to start to negotiate.
I wish you all the luck.
Okay, thank you. I know it.
Well, Mr. President, thank you so much. We all hope that you will be able to unblock the stalled accession process, and also thank you for the clear message that you reject ideas about changing borders coming out of shady non-papers very recently. Now going to Mr. Philip Ricker, who is undoubtedly one of the few people in Washington with such a deep knowledge of the Balkan region, Acting Assistant Secretary of the United States for European and Eurasian Affairs. Mr. Ricker, I heard you yesterday saying that the United States have never left the region. That might be partly true, if you allow me. Since the last 4 years, the problem was that the United States were not acting together with the European Union. In fact, some of Washington actions generated skepticism about Europe's ability to breathe new life into the enlargement process and, if you allow me, into the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue. So what should we expect from now on? And is there indeed a clear and joint strategy, and in which key policy areas? Thank you, Mr. Ricker.
Thank you, Blagodaram, and good morning. It's a distinct honor for me to follow three distinguished presidents whom I consider good friends, mentors, friends of the United States, as well as our other distinguished panelists today. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. I do want to acknowledge our gracious hosts for their coordination and efforts that have made this PRESPA forum possible, and to all the people of North Macedonia for hosting us. Of course, for me personally, it's always a pleasure to be here in the beautiful city of Ohrid that I first visited about 25 years ago. And it reminds us the context of history. This occasion itself is an historic milestone and a chance to recognize, frankly, how far we've come in the last 20 years since the signing of the Ohrid Framework Agreement, and in recent years, since the PRESPA agreement, and really is a chance to take stock of what comes next and exchange views among government leaders committed to the same end, to resolving the most pressing challenges facing the Western Balkans region. History can guide us, history can provide us context, but geography is for real and cannot be changed. The question was posed as to what can we expect from Washington? Well, I think this past month, the month of June, is a very good and real illustration of the Biden administration's foreign policy, the continuity of policies, in fact, that we've had throughout multiple administrations for decades. But President Biden, who came into office on January 21st, facing extraordinary challenges primarily from the COVID pandemic, and focused the first days and weeks, indeed months of his administration on dealing with COVID, getting it under control in our country, and then beginning to help around the world in the tradition of American leadership, focusing on vaccination, and then thinking all along about how we will recover economically as we emerge from this very difficult period. President Biden took his first trip as President of the United States to Europe. And he traveled first to Great Britain to see one of our oldest allies, and the historical irony there is never lost on us. We talk about the special relationship with the country from which we declared independence 245 years ago. But he also attended the G7 summit meeting, because to President Biden, to the United States, the G7 represents democracies, free market economies, the largest in the world, that come together to seek agreement on ways forward, voluntarily, together to deal with the great challenges of our time that include COVID, that include climate, that include the challenges of a rising China, as well as the possibilities that include the conflicts that we see around the world that this region knows too well from decades ago, that we together as leaders can solve. From there, he traveled to Brussels for the summit of the NATO alliance, celebrating with 30 allies, 29 others, including our most recent member of the alliance, North Macedonia. And for that, I am personally very proud, and so should the people here, and all of those who worked, including through the PRESPA agreement, to make that possible. This is about repairing relations. This is about revitalizing alliances. This is about reimagining what we can do together. Because as the President said, we cannot deal with any of the issues we face in the 21st century alone. Even an enormous country like the United States, with a tremendous military might, with an economy that no one could have imagined even just a generation or two ago, we have to work together to face the challenges that we have. And that was the President's message, NATO being the backbone of our transatlantic relationship. He went across the town then to have a summit meeting with the European Union, the first time that we've had a US-EU summit meeting since 2014. And that represented our strong partnership, the determination of President Biden and his administration to work closely with our European partners because we share the same values, and together we are able to take on the challenges that we see in our own backyards and around the world. And of course, he then took the opportunity, having underscored the importance of our alliances, to meet with President Putin, because nothing replaces face-to-face diplomacy, to discuss our hope that we can have a more stable and predictable relationship with Russia, but to make clear that if Russia behaves irresponsibly and aggressively against our interests or those of our allies and friends, there will be a price to pay. And so the following week, Secretary Blinken continued this transatlantic travel. Again, this focus on Europe by traveling, and I joined him in Berlin, in Paris, and in Rome. The three countries, Germany, France, and Italy, who belong to all three of those major groupings, the G7, NATO, and the EU, to reconfirm at a bilateral level our joint efforts, our interests, and how we will continue to work together, and to do that in a multilateral context, including the G20 meetings that were held in Italy, representing a significant part of the world's population and its economies. And from the G20, Secretary Blinken sent me here to Ohrid to underscore our firm interest and engagement with our European partners in seeing the Western Balkans fully integrated into the Euro-Atlantic family of nations. And so I think you've seen progress in just these few months, where we've held visits and calls with leaders throughout the region and with key European Union officials to indeed revitalize our efforts that never went away. But we met with the EU Special Representative for the Western Balkans, Miroslav Lajčák, who focuses on the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue. underscoring our long-standing commitment to the Western Balkans and the importance we place on cooperation and coordination with our allies and partners in realizing our vision, a vision that, as I said, has been consistent across multiple administrations for decades. It's too easy, I think, to take a year in which travel and diplomatic engagement was limited because of COVID to focus on certain meetings, highlights, individuals, and to forget the broad context of our engagement throughout this region over decades, generations, and indeed, in my own case, at least 25 years of direct engagement. It is a region here that we believe is at peace, can be at peace with itself and its neighbors, and fully integrated into this European Euro-Atlantic framework that President Biden knows is so important. Building on existing strong US-EU efforts in the Balkans is part of our overall priority to revitalize and raise the level of ambition of the transatlantic relationship. To that end, President Biden issued a new executive order. I think you've seen some news on that, updating and modernizing the Western Balkan sanctions regime, refining and modernizing the tools that the President has to reinforce our commitment to combating malign influence and corruption in the region, promoting accountability, and reflecting the importance we place, specifically mentioning the 2018 PRESPA agreement as well. In May, at the UN Security Council, Secretary Blinken was very clear that we need and want partners in all of these endeavors, and the EU's partnership in addressing the most pressing obstacles in the Western Balkans is indeed indispensable. For more than 2 decades, the vision and driver of US-European collaboration in the Western Balkans has been the Euro-Atlantic and European integration, motivating the kinds of reforms that enshrine, promote, and reward the common values and like-minded ideas throughout the transatlantic community. The EU accession process itself helps to lay the foundation necessary for prosperous and peaceful democracies. But I think we're all aware that the credibility and thus the influence of the EU in this regard in the region is right now at a low point. That's why I'm so inspired by President Pahor's remarks. The EU and all 27 member states must work to reestablish and restore that credibility if it's to be effective in promoting a seriousness of purpose in the Western Balkans. And this was very much a message in Secretary Blinken's meetings in Berlin, in Paris, in Rome. We need to make clear to leaders and peoples in the region that reform, progress, will indeed generate meaningful movement along a clear, tangible, and credible EU path. And we do this as the United States because it affects us too. Indecisiveness and inconsistency on this issue weakens the US-EU collective efforts throughout this region and gives openings to those who try to drive wedges within and among the members of the European Atlantic community. The decisions of EU member states to open accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania over a year ago was so uplifting to the whole region. Now we're at a critical juncture where the promise may no longer carry the same level of credibility unless real action follows, and to make good on that commitment. For more than a year now, we've seen EU member states failing to hold the first intergovernmental conferences with both aspirants. This will come. I don't need to go into the background of this here. President Pahor has already demonstrated that the Slovenian leadership and its presidency will address this in coming days. The dynamic is very well understood by all of us, and I'll just underscore that we believe it's inappropriate and corrosive to the EU's credibility, to our shared values for bilateral issues to hijack the EU accession process. German Foreign Minister Maas recently said, if these countries deliver, as North Macedonia and Albania indisputably have, then the EU must deliver. How can we effectively ask other countries in the region also pursuing the EU path that they undertake difficult reforms if they have strong and, in fact, empirical reasons to doubt that there's a payoff? So again, it's essential the EU member states follow through on their promises, and we hope to see that in coming weeks and months. Let me mention another place where the EU could shore up consistency and credibility, and that's visa liberalization for Kosovo. After repeated attestations by the European Commission and European Parliament that Kosovo achieved all the prerequisites for visa-free travel within the Schengen zone, denying Kosovo visa liberalization on top of the larger denial to Kosovo of a visible EU perspective saps the momentum for reforms, as well as the motivation to approach the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue with the spirit of compromise and flexibility that is necessary to secure a comprehensive normalization agreement. The lack of an agreement holds back both countries, the region, and frankly, all of Europe from reaching its potential. Holding Kosovo to a different standard weakens the argument for holding the Balkans to any standard. And let me just say, with respect to the dialogue, the United States strongly supports the EU-facilitated process. Special Representative Lajčák joined my Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and U.S. Special Representative for the Western Balkans, Matthew Palmer, on a joint trip to Pristina and Belgrade in early June to underscore our coordination. And together, we coordinated and encouraged Kosovo and Serbia to resume negotiations with both seriousness and urgency. We welcomed the high-level talks that resumed June 15th, and that process will continue with another meeting likely in July. All of these things reinforce what President Pahor's done with the Berta Baroni process. Both parties, as you know, are far apart, but the best way to bridge these differences is through dialogue. We believe a binding normalization agreement is the only way for these countries to reach their full potential and unlock their EU accession paths. And I can't imagine these countries taking their places in the transatlantic family without being able to conclude a normalization agreement. Normalization is exactly that. It's normal. We believe an enduring agreement is one that includes mutual recognition, which would allow both countries to really put their disputes behind them, to put history in context, and to move toward more secure, stable, and prosperous futures. Getting there demands flexibility, compromise, and forward thinking. We'd like to see more of this, and I'm quite confident our EU partners would too. Let me underscore that we, the United States, welcome and need the European Union's partnership and engagement, as well as the partnership and engagement of the leaders of these countries in this region to press ahead in other parts in terms of fulfillment of key reforms. One thing I want to point out, last year's great successes that went unnoticed during the pandemic was the electoral reform in Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Their citizens had the ability to vote in municipal elections for the first time in 12 years, resulting in formation of a city council and budget adoption so that citizens and their concerns could be addressed, that governing structures could deliver on behalf of the people who elect them. So the United States and its key European partners in Bosnia and Herzegovina spoke then with one voice and convinced the leaders in Bosnia and Herzegovina to accomplish something big and meaningful for its citizens. That unity of message is key to pressing ahead. And 2021, as a non-election year, I think is a crucial moment for Bosnia and Herzegovina to take another big step, finally addressing Sejdić-Finci and other European Court of Human Rights decisions through limited constitutional reform and to implement key ODIHR and Greco recommendations for freer and fairer elections. I realize how much more I have to say, and I don't want to go on much longer. So let me just say, we've got to also prioritize economic integration. So what citizens want is government to deliver for them, to give them better lives, better opportunities, to restore hope. And by prioritizing economic integration, which we believe is central to this region's future and prosperity and preparation for eventual EU membership for all, the United States strongly supports the Common Regional Market Initiative. Regional cooperation and economic integration is essential to the Western Balkans, particularly in the post-COVID recovery. It's also in the region's long-term interests and competitiveness. And in turn, a competitive Western Balkans region is one that's attractive to high-quality global investors who can offer alternatives to the predatory overtures by Russia and the People's Republic of China. To fully realize the enormous potential for prosperity, peace, and stability, the countries of the region must view their leaders' political commitments as starting points, not destinations, and seek to hold leaders accountable. And the leaders have to take real actions to press ahead on difficult reforms and resolve difficult political issues internally and with their neighbors to strengthen multi-ethnic democracies and judiciaries and to move towards a more prosperous, integrated future. The United States seeks to support competitive, integrated, and modernized markets, including energy markets, that will underpin diversified and resilient energy systems. And economies that aim to integrate more fully into the EU themselves may best be posed to do so by undertaking their own reforms, including with energy markets first. Let's consider how we might increase our investments, engagement, and influence in these areas. Let's not leave gaps in the effort, because geopolitical competitors will move to fill them. In conclusion, I want to mention one other issue discussed this morning, and that is how the Russian Federation capitalizes on this region's history of political and ethnic divisions. Exploiting the region's dependence on Russian energy and the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church, endemic corruption, weak rule of law, cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and unresolved political and territorial disputes, Russia has sought to undermine good governance and keep tensions alive and prevent reforms that would bring these countries into the Western fold. So we all must be attuned to that. This was President Biden's message broadly as he spoke in June at the 3 summits to underscore, again, as we have for decades, that we are deeply invested. The United States is deeply invested in European development and security, and we remain so today because it is in the United States' interests to be that invested. A Europe whole, free, and at peace is a stronger partner for the United States. And as the President says, we all need partners, bilaterally and multilaterally. So then, as now our goal is in the Western Balkans is to work with our like-minded international and local partners to support and advance aspirations of these countries to realize their strategic goal of European integration. I very much look forward to hearing from others on this panel and throughout the continuation of this forum on how we might utilize this strong US-EU relationship to accelerate that process. Thank you very much.
Mr. Riccio, thank you so much. And I think many of here of the audience would definitely like to hear that the United States will prioritize the economic integration of the region, since this is the key for the prosperity and the better lives of the people of the Western Balkans. Now, turning to Mr. Johannes Hahn, who may currently holding a different portfolio in the European Commission, but undoubtedly, his name is very much linked with one of the core EU policies, that is enlargement. Well, Mr. Hahn, I would like to pose the same question that I posed to Mr. Riccio. Is there any clear joint strategy between the EU and the US? And could you define the key policy areas in which the two global powers should develop this strategy? Thank you, Mr. Hahn.
Thank you very much for your question. Good morning to everybody, and thank you for all these interesting and inspiring speeches so far. And I see a lot of, so to say, overlappings and joint interests. I think let me start by, let's say, painting a little bit a global picture. And the global picture is, first, it's good to have the US return in the group of like-minded states interested in a multilateralism concept and And this is so important because for Europe, multilateralism is key in order to not only restore, but to keep and to further develop a peaceful world where we can rely each other on agreements, on international cooperation, treaties, etc., and having mutual respect for what we are doing and what are our interests. The 21st century is different to the short 20th century, a century of multipolarity. And in this, we all play an important role. But multipolarity is the one thing. On the other thing, I think this 21st century will be marked by an ideological polarization, which is different to the one we have seen in the 20th century. And this is, on the one hand, an autocratic system combined with turbo capitalism, whereas we are, so to say, representing democracy, freedom, market economy, social market economy. And in that, I think we are united with the United States. We are in the same boat promoting these values, these interests. And having said this, we can see these tendencies, and it was said, for instance, by President Djukanovic, but also by others, that here in the region we already face this kind of competition is maybe the wrong word, but I would even say, to a certain extent, fight between different concepts, how to organize the life of people. And we are very much committed to democracy, to freedom, to rule of law, to market economy, giving individuals the opportunity to pursue their own interests, their own destinies, their own future, fortune. And I think this is exactly what unites us and what we have to translate into concrete actions. And it was already said what is, so to say, the approach of the US, and it's actually the same of the European Union looking in the region. I always said in my previous capacity, either we as Europeans, as European unions, because we're all Europeans, export stability, or we would import instability. And I think it's so crucial to work on the economic development of the region. We have launched a few years ago the regional economic market. Unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of progress. But the idea of this regional economic market was to have quasi a kind of rehearsal for the future inclusion into the single market. The more you are working, so to say, on a regional economic market with similar conditions, privileges, if you like, the more you are aligned already with the future single market and, of course, certain challenges you might face joining the European single market. And I regret, but nevertheless, I think we always have to make a new attempt to revive this concept, and not only to revive the concept, but really starting to implement it. A lot have been said, and probably even till the end of this conference, about the inability of the European Union so far to start the negotiation talks with North Macedonia and Albania. And honestly, I don't have to say anything about this. This cannot be defended. There is a clear failure on our side, and I regret that we are not there where we should be, because it's clear, it has been confirmed, the European Commission has made a lot of reports that the countries have delivered, and we have always said, once they have delivered, we have to deliver, and we haven't done so far. So I hope that during the Slovenian presidency, indeed, 6 months seems to be short, but nevertheless, in politics, it could be some time to achieve something. And more or less, I have spent the last couple of weeks a little bit to explore things and situations in the different countries, because now, no longer officially in charge, I can a little bit act under the radar screen. On the other hand, as a budget commissioner, you always have hooks to come into the debate. I think there is a way. There is a way if politicians go into the lead. If we leave it to the experts, scientists, don't be misunderstood, there won't be a result. But the core competence of a good politician, of a leader, as we have seen it, for instance, in Prespa, is to strike a deal, to have a compromise, a good compromise, which is finally a win-win situation for everybody. And to have a compromise means to show leadership, because you have to give up on one or the other position, but at the end, both parts benefit more than if there would not be an agreement, if there would not be a compromise. So now it's high time for politicians to show leadership, to go and to see how we can resolve this. But coming back, what we both, the US and Europe, should do, and I think the agenda is clear. We have to invest into the economic development, but, and this I have to recall and to repeat, don't underestimate, and maybe here the sensitivity inside the Union has increased in the last couple of months or maybe even years, the importance of rule of law. Certainly also because of the situation we are facing inside the Union. And we have seen developments we didn't anticipate in the past, also not in our treaty. Our treaty has definitely weaknesses, how to react to developments we are facing in some of our member states. But it is as it is. On the other hand, I have to tell you, here there is clearly a significant increased sensitivity, and I know about what I'm speaking because I have also the pleasure to be in charge of the rule of law conditionality and to see how this new instrument has to be implemented. And therefore, once the negotiations have started, be clear, be absolutely clear that rule of law is a crucial element. And if we have seen not the opening of further chapters with those member states which are already negotiating with the Union a future accession, it's due to a slowdown or even a standstill in rule of law developments. So I was always convinced, and I'm still convinced about it, that there is a link between economic development and rule of law. The one can trigger the other and vice versa. And in that respect, and I'm saying this now as the Commissioner in charge of budget, for the current multi-annual financial framework, we have foreseen 9 billion of grant funding for the region till 2027 and another 20 billion in leveraged investment. Honestly, I am not aware that any other country bloc is providing that amount. And there are some, honestly, I'm not aware about any Chinese grant. I'm aware about some not very favorable Chinese loans, but I'm not aware about any grants. And this is a difference. And I would also ask to speak about this. Of course, I admit that, so to say, the provisioning of money from the European Union is linked to some criteria. But these criteria finally are aiming to prepare the countries for the future membership. So it's an investment. It's an investment, it's a double investment. It's an investment in the development of the country, in the infrastructure, in the welfare of people. And by the way, we also have to invest in order to avoid a further brain drain. We are facing a brain drain here in the region, not only from those who are not yet members, but also member states in the region and at the border of the region to other parts of the Union. And this is something we have to reverse, because it's not healthy if the best parts, the most energetic, the most dynamic, the best trained ones are leaving the country and countries are depending on remittances. So I think the agenda for all of us is clear. Of course, we need dialogue, but we also have to deliver, to implement from words to do's. And in that respect, let's go together, let's work together, let's invest, let's push the economic development. And I'm deeply convinced again that economic development, attracting domestic but also foreign investors, will also trigger more, so to say, independence of the judiciary, because investors want to rely on a functioning judicial system. And there is already a lot of progress in the region, but of course more has to be done. But I think we should be optimistic, and those who know me for some time know that I'm not only member of a political party, but I'm also member of the party of the half-full class and not of the half-empty class. So if there's there and there one or the other hiccup, don't be discouraged. See it as a new challenge, and if we take these challenges, then we are able to overcome this, and finally we can have another agreement. North Macedonia, in the meantime, is famous for its agreements, so don't stop with the ones we have already. Let's see that we get other ones too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hahn, and let's see all of us the bottle half full rather than half empty. Gentlemen, we're running out of time, so I would like to ask Mr. Alain Richard, Senator and former Minister of Defense of France, his assessment about the potential synergy between the EU and the US in this part of Europe. Let's not forget that the Western Balkans are part of Europe, but if you could be as short as possible. Thank you so much, Mr. Richard.
I'll do my best, and of course, thanking for all the organization of this welcome conference and meeting. If the question is, do the European Union and the US converge on the willingness to integrate the Western Balkans within the EU, the answer is yes. But there are nuances, and of course I would like to offer, and it's natural to be so, because we're an alliance, and we have strong political convergences and affections. But there are nuances, and I want to stress a little about our European Union decision-making, which is, of course, strongly linked with the process of accession. We are a treaty, we are not a nation. And we have in common quite a large, broad range of decisions, but most sovereignty and international issues decisions are out of the treaty. We have to agree. That's unanimity. And it's, of course, it needs a big effort. And why do we sometimes fail to agree or take much time to agree? Because our internal cohesion, I'm speaking for one of the member states, and I cannot, of course, offer a synthetic appreciation. But we have several issues of potential disagreement or different tendencies. I can quote three. the apparition of the development of illiberalism, of different understandings of the rule of law and civil rights within the Union and within the public opinions of several other members. We have a disagreement or a dispute over migration, not so much about the overall assessment of the movements, but about the sharing of the effort of integration of migration between the 27. We have some disputes over the level and the methods of economic regulations and tax policies. All these questions appear also in a large democracy like the US, but the ways of treating the issues is substantially different. And we also have different perceptions and sometimes attitudes towards the other big powers who are questioning the world order and appear sometimes as threats. So these nuances or disagreements sometimes make difficult to find common, unanimous decisions on some of the issues. Of course, we all agree on the basic issues, human rights and rule of law, social market economy, and being a positive contributor to global issues and challenges, most important now, the climate. But that's the reason why there is the conference which is starting. We need to review not only between the government and the parliaments, but also the civil societies and the opinions, where we stand collectively on these main subjects. So when we look at the accession process, some of these issues reappear, and it takes time for us to have the same appreciation. France, my country, President Macron, has made an effort to change, to modernize, and to make maybe more effective the accession process and to give some guarantees, some advantages to the acceding countries. But we take time to make this effective now. And I want simply to stress that from the acceding countries or the candidate countries, we are, especially most of us, and I think finally the whole community, we are especially attentive, vigilant on a few issues which are rather political than social or economic, which are the press, the courts, the risk of corruption, and the way to decide democratically. So it's a dialogue, and I think really that probably all the governments in the European Union want to achieve and to succeed in the accession process. But we'll have to have a dialogue with our public opinions. We'll have to convince them that it's better to have 6 more members, whereas we sometimes fail to agree between the 27 we have. So it's going to be a challenge, and we'll do our best to convince, when the time has come, the public opinions. But of course, the public opinions of the Western Balkan countries have also to be convinced, and I have full trust in the leaders who are present here to make their best efforts to convince the public opinions and civil societies here in the Western Balkans that the efforts are worthwhile.
Well, Mr. Richard, thank you. They're definitely worthwhile. You gave me food for thought and more questions, but we're running out of time, especially regarding whether the EU should think about the abolishment of unanimity, about the abolishment of the unanimity in decision-making in foreign policy issues, and some other issues that you raised, but we're running out of time. I'm going now to Mr. Thomas Garrett, Secretary General of the Community of Democracies. Mr. Garrett, what are perhaps the challenges that urgently need to be addressed in the following months in the region of the Western Balkans, and how could this synergy between EU and the US better address this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, distinguished guests. In the interest of time, I'm going to abbreviate my remarks, but I do want to start by saying how very honored I am to be in the PRESPA Forum Dialogue. And I want to also say how very honored I feel to have spent the last 2 days in the presence of so many men and women who brought about the accomplishments that we're celebrating these 2 days. North Macedonia is the newest member of the Governing Council of the Community of Democracies, and it's the first Governing Council member state from the Western Balkans. For those who don't know, the Community of Democracies is an intergovernmental coalition that supports adherence to common democratic values and standards, and our member states work together on these issues. What makes the Community of Democracies different as a coalition of states is that it is not built on geographical or regional or economic criteria, but it's built on commitment to values of democracy that are found in the Warsaw Declaration, which is our founding document, and it's composed of 19 principles of human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. The Warsaw Declaration it was founded upon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, especially the central idea that human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. But the Warsaw Declaration went on in the year 2000 to include new rights and principles, standards that were not found in existing treaties at that time. So you find within the Warsaw Declaration language specifically on media freedoms and on civilian control of the military. And many, many countries were engaged in the shaping of this document. It was a common endeavor, and it was not only meant to recall the existing commitments that democratic governments had made to that point, but it also was to help establish standards necessary to help states enter and remain on the path to democracy. As I said, I'm going to abbreviate my remarks, so let me just note a few things that I think make it very different. Democracies channel dissent through nonviolent means, and they manage conflict through respect for the rule of law and human rights. As we've seen in the region, countries with strong records of respect for democracy and human rights are far less likely to experience civil wars and conflict. It's instead the authoritarian states, the failed states, which are likely to experience this type of conflict and to generate refugees and to hinder women's equality. Democracies are more likely to include women and youth in security as more gender-equal societies experience less conflict. I want to commend the speakers from yesterday's outstanding panel here on women, peace, and security. I think they so clearly illustrated this lesson. Today that we find that both established democracies and young democracies have the same challenges. The challenges are extremely similar between both. Today there is no democracy that moves only from triumph to triumph. But today in this world, every democracy faces changing threats and new opportunities. And we have seen, I think, both challenges and opportunities so clearly in the examples that have been given by North Macedonia. At the Community of Democracies, we recognize that the best means of addressing these challenges to democracy is through dialogue and common action. And these are the examples that have been provided to the rest of the world by the Ohrid Framework Agreement. And I can say that this example is needed today. We've heard reference to that in some of the remarks earlier. Through disinformation, misinformation, and even sometimes malign interference in democratic societies, we see that authoritarian governments are becoming increasingly effective in trying to market a different model of governance, one that is in clear opposition to democracy. And so if we are to ensure democracy is strengthened, for instance, in the coming post-pandemic world, democracies need to come together and to counter this narrative. And they need to find that ability to come together in groups such as the Community of Democracies, but also within the European Union, working in multilateral fashion at the United Nations. And so let me go ahead and just close by noting that, excuse me, find my place again here, that we see around the world nations gather under a number of different banners. Sometimes it's under a regional banner. Sometimes they gather on a platform of cultural or even religious platform. And I think it's time now for us to see a bloc that is actually founded upon adherence to explicitly stated human rights and democratic values. And so as we look at this title, Resetting the EU-US Synergy on the Western Balkans, I would just encourage that North Macedonia provides an example of how the reset can be based upon nations that uphold the same values and the same ideas. And it can be done with nations that want to build bridges towards the same goals and aspirations. As mentioned earlier, reform and progress are the qualities that we see in Ohrid, that we see in Prespa, and that we see in the example North Macedonia has given. And I think this is going to be of great help in trying to reset the opportunities and to reset the synergy. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you today.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thomas Garrett. Now, I have forgotten to mention that we have here with us Ambassador Mr. Ervan Huere, who will sum up the conclusions on what has been said during the first and the second part of this high-level plenary session. Your Excellencies, thank you so much for your interventions. I really wish we had time for questions. We have heard some encouraging ideas and some clear messages. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your participation in this first part of this high-level plenary session. We will have a 10 to 15 minutes break before the second part of this session. And gentlemen, I think you should follow me for the family photo. Thank you. Thank you so much.